Joining BYU Sports Nation now as advertised, the fabulous Blaine Fowler.
Uncle B.
Yeah, Uncle B
Uncle
back
B.
on the show. Blaine, BYU is a hot topic in college athletics for a number of reasons. We've been discussing the whole Big 12 knee-jerk reaction, so we're going to start there. What do you think about BYU and their possibility of joining the Big 12 at some point in the near future? Are you buying into all of this?
Actually, I am. And I read an article in the Sporting News that talked about the fact that the Big 12, like, they've already been having discussions about this before they just got slapped in the face and didn't get included, with TCU and Baylor both left out of the Final Four for the playoffs this season. So I think it just moves things along a bit faster. And I know that, a year ago, the Big 12 was saying, well, it would take a couple of years of us not being included, but the pressure is on them right now, and if there's ever an opportunity for BYU to make a case, BYU ought to make a case right now. And they ought to go in and say, listen, here's what we can bring in terms of television revenue. Anybody else you're looking at isn't going to bring any additional television revenue, but we may be able to convince ESPN to sweeten the pot a little bit if we come to the league as a result of our current contract with them. I think it's a fit for a lot of reasons, and timing couldn't be better. And, I'm not a huge Urban Meyer Ohio State fan, but the fact that they got in and they leapfrogged is good for BYU in the
Saint
long run.
Urban.
That's right. So speaking of timing, Blaine, how fast do you think that BYU can get into the Big 12 if they were to receive that invite?
Well, the good thing that's the other thing that makes BYU so attractive, Brian, is that they're not encumbered by conference problems.
Right.
So say you go after somebody in another major conference. First of all the conferences have changed their television deals where they've got proprietary rights to the television rights, all kinds of issues with going after a team from the ACC or even the American Athletic Conference or even the Mountain West, with them having buyouts out of their conference contracts and all kinds of things. BYU has nothing to hold them back from a football perspective from moving to the Big 12 because they have no conference affiliation and no contracts that would prohibit them from being able to move right in there and get it going. So if the Big 12 were to make an overture in this offseason and say, we want you, that could happen almost immediately. There would be very little legal work to do behind the scenes, comparatively speaking, to going after somebody in another major conference.
Blaine Fowler with us on BYU Sports Nation, talking BYU to potentially the Big 12 if or when that will happen. Blaine, we've been discussing the fact that the Big 12 is going to try anything and everything before they feel an absolute necessity to expand because it's such a cumbersome and laborious process. And the one thing they can do is bolster their non-conference schedule and then try and get a conference championship game. If those two things happen, why would you not stay at 10 teams?
Well, if they can get a conference championship with 10, but in the past, NCAA rules have prohibited them from doing that. You have to have 12 teams with 2-16 divisions to stage a conference championship. And so if they could get an exception and allow them to somehow stage a conference championship, because really that's what kept them out of it this year. It wasn't the fact that TCU had a worse loss or Baylor had a worse loss or that they were co-conference champions. The bottom line was Ohio State played another game. And Ohio State played another game against another quality opponent and got a 13th game in and a 12th win. And that was the deciding factor. And heck, even if Baylor and TCU had played each other again, perhaps the winner of that game would leapfrog Ohio State because of strength of schedule. You'd make a case for it. So, and if they could have that where they were assured of inclusion, they wouldn't have any incentive to expand because it's just one more mouth to feed when you start to split the television revenue pie. But I don't know that they're going to be able to do it without adding a couple of teams. And so they probably don't just need to add one. They need to add two teams. They need 2 16 divisions, and they need to stage a conference championship game. And why not take BYU and Boise State and let them be natural, rival partners right out here in the West, expand the Big 12 to the West, and go with that. That's what I say.
Blaine Fowler with us on BYU Sports Nation. Blaine, I don't want to spend too much more time on this speculation that BYU gets to the Big 12, because right now that's all it is. It's just reports, and it certainly had stoked up the fire of expansion for the conference. But I want to ask this. Is it a reality that BYU could go to the Big 12 as a football-only member? And if so, how much stock would you put in that?
I've wondered about that for the last couple of years. When there was talk, and I know that it was just talk, there weren't any substantial conversations about BYU going in the past. There was all this talk about, well, what about all these other sports that have Sunday play and all those things? From the very beginning, I've said, well, just stay right where you are in all of your other sports. That's fine. The West Coast Conference is great for most sports. And as an independent football program, just join as a football program only. And I think that idea would have some merit. Now, ideally for all other sports, can you imagine BYU in the Big 12 Conference in basketball? How fun would that be?
Amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it would be awesome. And so I think BYU's first priority would be, hey, we want all of our sports in. We want to be a part of this conference, lock, stock, and barrel. But if that's just not a possibility, I would not be opposed. This is just me personally. I would not be opposed to a football-only arrangement with the Big 12. Not at all.
Blaine Fowler with us on BYU Sports Nation once again. And okay, let's push the Big 12 aside now and talk about the Miami Beach Bowl. BYU gets Memphis. Brian called them yesterday the best team that you've probably never paid attention to or heard of. And I've been high on Memphis all year because of what they've done against good teams like UCLA and Ole Miss. And they had the one setback against Houston they had 5 turnovers, and they still almost won that game. What do you think about BYU and Memphis in the Miami Beach Bowl?
I think it's a scary opponent for BYU. I really do.
Couldn't agree more.
And because they're playing really well right now. They're on a 6-game winning streak. Now, I know it's been SMU and Tulsa and Temple and Tulane. But South Florida's a quality program, and they beat them 31-10. And comparatively, they finished up the regular season with a win over UConn. They pummeled them 41-10. And you're right, that Houston loss was just marred by turnovers. But I like the schedule they played. I like the fact that they stepped up and played UCLA. They played Middle Tennessee. They beat Middle Tennessee 36-17. They played them at home. So I like the fact that they played UCLA. I like the fact that they played Ole Miss. And, oh, by the way, they beat the crap out of Cincinnati this season.
41-14.
And Cincinnati's a pretty good football team. And so this is a very hot team right now that's coming into this game with a lot of confidence. And so it's a little bit scary. And I think of all the teams in the AAC, and they could have picked Cincinnati or Central Florida or East Carolina or Memphis for this game, right? And the league, which owns this bowl game, chose to send Memphis. And I think that since they own the bowl game, they wanted to send their best representative. I think the league thinks that this is the best team in their league right now, and I believe that that's the case. And so BYU is going to play the best team at this time from the AAC. They better be ready to play.
Uncle B, I agree with all of that. And on paper, it looks like the best matchup, and it's exciting. But when you look at it from a brand standpoint, looking at Central Florida being in a BCS game, and Cincinnati a BCS game a few years ago as well. To me, I feel like a win over those type of programs would carry more weight than over a Memphis who doesn't really have that national recognition. What do you think?
I agree with you, Brian. And here's what I'm thinking. From BYU's perspective, East Carolina had so much publicity at the beginning of the year. They were talking about them like they were talking about BYU. Could this be the non-P5 team that breaks in? Of course, it ends up being Boise State. But so because of that, I think the casual fan that's just tuning in would make more of a victory over East Carolina or Central Florida. They're more familiar. But from the American Athletic Conference's perspective, they wanted to put a team against BYU that they thought had the best chance to beat BYU. Because BYU is a big name and in the limelight. And so they chose Memphis for that reason, not for who would have the best reputation going in there, but who they actually thought could beat BYU. And they're coming in there. Memphis is all about defense this year, and they're scoring some points, but they have a top 25 defense, and they're top 5 in the nation in scoring defense. They're 17.1 points a game. So this is an interesting matchup of strengths. It's BYU's offense that I think has been playing really well down the stretch and throwing it all over the place. against a defense that's top 25 defense in the country. It's going to be a fun matchup. And on offense, they're pretty balanced. They got a quarterback in Paxton Lynch he's thrown for over 2,700 yards. He got 18 touchdowns, just 6 interceptions.
Wow.
And they move the ball pretty well. They average 420 yards a game and over 34 points a game. So it's a solid team offensively, but they're lights out defensively. And I'm telling you, if BYU doesn't bring their A game, this is going to be a struggle.
Dual threat analyst Blaine Fowler with us on BYU Sports Nation, former BYU national champion quarterback from 1984. Bronco Mendenhall has now taken BYU to 10 consecutive bowl games, and it's no surprise he is now on the radar of a number of other teams that are looking for head coaches, as he has been, it seems, every year, because Bronco's name just consistently gets brought up. But we have a report today from Jamie Newberg, Scout.com national recruiting analyst, that says this: I have been told that Oregon State has had phone discussions with 4 candidates for their head coaching vacancy: Brady Hoke, BYU coach Bronco Mendenhall, Matt Wells, Utah State, and Eastern Washington coach Bo Baldwin. Blaine, what is your reaction to the fact that Bronco is being pursued by Power 5 conference teams?
I'm not surprised at all. And think about this. If you're Oregon State, would he not be on the top of your list? I mean, think about this. He played there. He coached there. He knows their systems. He knows the university. He knows that area. He's been highly successful. He knows how to run a clean program, which is really important to Oregon State. Mike Riley's that's one thing Oregon State's always kept their noses clean. Academically, they've been good. They run a clean program. They don't embarrass the community up there. It's a small town. And so if you're Oregon State, he should be number 1 on your list. Now, I don't know if they're number 1 on Bronco's list, but if he's not number 1 on Oregon State's list, they're crazy. Of course they should come after him. Absolutely. And in due diligence, Bronco owes it to himself and to his alma mater to at least have a discussion with him. He owes it to them because that's where he went to school. That's who gave him his first coaching opportunity. So he owes them at least a conversation. And if they don't aggressively go after him, I would be really, really surprised.
Blaine Fowler with us on BYU Sports Nation, delivering the goods. Blaine, great to talk to you. Really interesting stuff. We'll look forward to seeing you in the future. And if you're down here for the BYU-Utah basketball game, which I have a hunch you might be, we'll see you tomorrow.